Good morning. My name is Karen Hesli, and I'm here to introduce my friend David Moody. He's going to be speaking on the urgency and the paradox of change. But before he begins, I'd like to say a few words about his recent book and other book that he's written. David's recent book, Krishnamurti in America, New Perspectives on the Man and His Message, is a full-scale biography of Krishnamurti's life, and with special attention to the important events in the United States that haven't previously been written about. Also, David's previous book was called An Uncommon Collaboration, David Bohm and J. Krishnamurti. This book reviews the entire career of theoretical physicist David Bohm, with special attention to his interactions and relationship with Krishnamurti. And as a result of writing this book, David was selected to participate as one of the people interviewed in the recent documentary film about David Bohm called Infinite Potential. I met David back in 1980 and appreciated his work as the director of education at the school, and he held that position until the time of Kay's death, and then later he took a PhD at UCLA. His books are published under his full name, as you can see, davidedmundmoody.com, and you can learn more or leave a message for him there at his website. So it's a great pleasure to introduce David to you and to welcome David. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Karen and I used to work together many years ago at the Oak Grove School. And some of you might not know, but this room was part of the living quarters, or just adjacent to Krishnamurti's private living quarters when he lived in Ojai. And it was in this room that he held dialogues, talks with the teachers and parents at Oak Grove School. And when he would conduct those dialogues, he would have his chair situated almost exactly where I'm standing. So it's a little bit intimidating to occupy this particular position and talk about his teachings. But that's what I'm going to try to do today. So I think that most of you know that the theme of the gathering this year is the urgency of change. And when I learned about that a few weeks ago, that was a topic that caught my attention for several reasons. That theme is taken from the title of one of Krishnamurti's books, a book that was edited by his authorized biographer, Mary Lutchens. And I've always wondered about that title for this reason. The concept of urgency brings in the notion of time. It suggests that something must be done very soon, which is a concept related to time. Something has got to occur in the near future, but nevertheless in the future. And to bring in time to the idea of change is something that Krishnamurti was very sensitive about. Over and over in his dialogues, whenever someone uses a word that suggests that time is a factor in change, he has a tendency to object very strongly. And so I've always been curious to know how that concept, or how that word, got attached to the title of one of his books. And recently I began to look into this a little bit more closely, and it turns out that Mary Lutchens discusses this particular book and the title of it in the second volume of her biography of Krishnamurti. It's called Years of Fulfillment. And in that book, she pinpoints the selection of that title as being derived from a particular talk that Krishnamurti gave at the Sanan gathering in 1971. And her description kind of suggests that the urgency of change was a major theme of the talk that year. So because I was interested in that title, recently I looked up that talk online and I printed it out and read it. And I was kind of surprised to learn that Krishnamurti doesn't use that phrase at all in his talk. And in fact, the urgency of change is not really a particular theme of that talk. This talk is actually about how we deal with problems, which Krishnamurti says we deal with problems in a fragmentary way, each one as if it's separate from all the others. And so it was in response to that issue that the question of urgency was raised, not by Krishnamurti, but by one of the questioners in the audience. And what the questioner said was this. He said, at the beginning of the talk, you were asking what made us try to solve problems separately. And is not urgency one of the reasons which cause us to try to solve problems separately? And in response to that question, Krishnamurti said, if you see a danger, you act. In that action, there's no question of urgency, no impatience. You act. The urgency only takes place when you see the danger as a danger to me, the me of thought. But when you see the total danger of thought dividing the world, that seeing is the urgency and the action. The very change is urgency. It is not that change will come about through urgency. So it's not really clear that Krishnamurti himself ever expressed or endorsed this idea of the urgency of change. On the other hand, he clearly did embrace the notion of change itself. He often spoke in terms of transformation or mutation or what he called psychological revolution. But the relationship between time and transformation was a very sensitive issue for him. And so I don't think we can understand what he meant by change unless we also look very carefully at what he also had to say about time. And in order to bring out the significance of this issue, I think it might be helpful to also look at another issue that was very significant to him. And some of you may recall that Krishnamurti conducted a series of dialogues in 1980 with David Bohm. And that series of dialogues was published under the title, The Ending of Time. And in that series of dialogues, in the very first conversation, right at the beginning of the first conversation, Krishnamurti raises quite a fundamental question. He asks whether humanity has taken what he calls a wrong turn. So he and Bohm were considering the entire evolutionary development of the human species over the course of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. And in that context, Krishnamurti was asking whether something has entered into the very fabric of human consciousness, some kind of flaw or a mistake or what he calls a wrong turn in the development of the species. And Bohm agrees that something of that kind must have taken place. And they begin to explore what the wrong turn could possibly have been. And Krishnamurti suggests that it may be that the wrong turn was what he calls the process of becoming. And that is to improve oneself inwardly, to become psychologically more and more and more, he says. Now, this is the process that we often think of as self-improvement. You know, it's related to what we call self-esteem and all of the techniques that we have for, you know, improving or enhancing our self-esteem. And in a sense, you know, I think it's fair to say that this notion of becoming or self-improvement it's kind of the essential creed of modern life. You know, probably many of us, or most of us, are engaged in some kind of process of becoming or self-improvement, either subtly or obviously, a great deal of the time. But in this exchange with Bohm, Krishnamurti says that becoming may be the source of a fundamental flaw in the whole development of humanity. So I think it behooves us to look closely at what he means by becoming, especially as we're considering the meaning of change in his philosophy. Because, you know, normally the process of becoming someone better or new or different is more or less equivalent to what we mean by change. So this is the question I would like to focus on for the remainder of this talk. You know, there seems to be a kind of paradox here. You know, on the one hand, Krishnamurti strongly advocates in favor of what he calls psychological revolution. But on the other hand, he totally disparages change in the ordinary sense of someone becoming something more or better than what he or she is at present. So how are we to resolve this paradox? And this will bring us back to the question that we raised at the very beginning, which is the question of time. Because that's a crucial feature of the whole of Krishnamurti's philosophy. And I think it will help us to resolve the paradox between psychological transformation on one hand and the process of becoming on the other. So with this background in mind, we need to enter into the heart of Krishnamurti's philosophy and talk in more detail about what he was really trying to communicate. And we have to be careful here because Krishnamurti was very concerned about anyone coming along and trying to interpret his teachings. He often stressed that he didn't want to have any interpreters of his message, either while he was alive or after he was gone. You know, he felt his teachings could speak for themselves, and he especially objected to anyone assuming a position of authority or acting as though they were the official representative of his teachings. So I have to be clear that I'm not assuming any authority. I'm just a student of Krishnamurti's work. I'm not an official representative or anything of that kind. And, you know, what I have to say might have some value if it facilitates your own exploration, but not because I have any inside knowledge or special understanding. And we should also remember also that Krishnamurti's teaching is always about, you know, exploring oneself directly, understanding oneself, not some abstract set of ideas or concepts. So with that in mind, you know, what we have here is a paradox, which is an apparent contradiction that goes right to the heart of Krishnamurti's whole philosophy. On one hand, he strongly advocates for a psychological revolution, but on the other hand, he suggests there's a flaw in the whole development of humanity, and that flaw is the drive to become someone psychologically more or better than what we are at present. So how can we reconcile these two imperatives in his teaching? How can the need for transformation possibly coexist with, you know, with denying or rejecting the process of what he calls becoming? So in order to resolve this paradox, I think we have to look more deeply into what Krishnamurti meant by the process of becoming and what was his objection to it. So let's be clear what is happening when we engage in this process. It may not be obvious at first, but the process of becoming implicitly entails something taking place in time. It only has meaning in the context of the present and the future. And the future clearly entails time. Now, Krishnamurti, as we've said, feels it is very important to understand time. He says, time is the psychological enemy of man. But why? What is the problem with time in his view? So Krishnamurti maintains there are really two different kinds of time. And sometimes he speaks as though most people already understand and agree that there's two different kinds of time. But I think his point of view is really very unusual here, and we have to pause to make sure that we understand what he's saying. So let's look at what we ordinarily mean by time. Let's try to look from a very, very simple, straightforward point of view. What do we mean when we say, what time is it? Or what time shall I meet you tomorrow? Or how much time does it take to drive from here to Los Angeles? All these ordinary ways we think about time are not a problem for Krishnamurti. All of that is what he calls chronological time. It's the everyday time that we measure with a clock or a calendar, and he has no problem with it. He thinks it's perfectly reasonable and easy to understand and useful. And so when he says that time is the psychological enemy of man, he's not in any way referring to this ordinary, everyday meaning or use of this term. So Krishnamurti maintains there's another kind of time altogether, which he calls psychological time. And in order to grasp this distinction, I think it's helpful to see that chronological time measures changes in physical space, like the Earth going around the sun or the time that it takes to hard boil an egg. But Krishnamurti's idea of psychological time involves changes in psychological space. That would be the kind of space where I myself can change into something else. If I'm afraid, I might think that I will be brave tomorrow. Or if I'm uncertain, I might hope that in the future I can have clarity or become certain, say if I meditate or do certain things. So these are changes or movements in psychological space and time. Now, to understand Krishnamurti's whole philosophy, it's very important to understand this distinction. And even though we've described it somewhat, it can still be confusing in certain cases. But we need to be clear about this because Krishnamurti says that psychological time is actually an illusion. He says that kind of time doesn't really exist. And that is part of why he says that time is the psychological enemy of man. So let's consider an example. Suppose I'm a young man who has just graduated from college, and now I think that I would like to become a lawyer. I feel like if I'm a lawyer, I will be a worthwhile member of society and an important person. And so that seems to be what Krishnamurti means by psychological time, right? It's the projection of myself psychologically into the future. But why is that illusory? And is that really different from chronological time? Law school takes 3 years, and after that, I have to pass the bar exam, and then I'll become a lawyer. So how is that an illusion? And how can that be, the enemy of mankind? So there seems to be some kind of distinction here that is very, very clear to Krishnamurti, but maybe not quite so clear to the rest of us. And that might be part of the reason why we don't always make this distinction between chronological time and psychological time. So when Krishnamurti refers to psychological time, he typically invokes some kind of scenario like the following. Suppose I have a feeling of dissatisfaction with who I am or what I am inwardly, psychologically. I feel that I want to be, more intelligent or more confident or more spiritual or whatever it may be. So I project an image in my mind of the person I would like to become in the future, and I start to look for ways to achieve my goal. Now, this is the process of becoming that we referred to earlier, and we need to understand exactly why that is problematical or illusory, and how is that different from the person who wants to become a lawyer and has a straightforward path through chronological time to achieve his goal. So I think we can get a clue to unravel these issues if we remember what Krishnamurti has to say about the psychological self. Okay, the self is what I think of as I or me. We feel that not only physically, but inwardly, psychologically, we are a being, a person, someone who thinks and observes and decides what I'm going to do. And it is that self, that psychological entity, that we hope will become something else, something more or better than what we are at present. Now, Krishnamurti maintains that we have a deep misunderstanding about what we think of as myself. We think of myself as a real, actual, living, existing being, just as real as our body. Or rather, we don't really think about it, we just assume it. It's as obvious to us as the nose on our face. Not only that, but the living actuality of ourself is, maybe for many of us, the most important thing in our lives. But Krishnamurti says that the psychological entity, myself, is not the actual living thing that we take it to be. He says it is really a kind of memory or a collection of memories that merge together to form an image. So the self that we hold so dear and feel is so real and alive is actually more like a photograph. It's as if we were mistaking the picture or photograph of a flower for an actual flower. And that difference is extremely significant. So, if I have a pound or two of clay, I can mold it into any shape I like. What starts out as just a lump of clay can become a bowl or a vase or a coffee cup or a work of art. If I have a seed, I can plant it in the ground and it can become a shoot and a plant and a flower. And somewhat similarly, a caterpillar can become a butterfly. And so if I myself am something real, as actual as a lump of clay or a seed or a caterpillar, maybe I can become something else too. Maybe I can engage in the process of becoming. But a photograph cannot do that. A photograph is an image of something in the past. It is fixed, frozen in time. It does not have the inward capacity to develop or transform into something else entirely. So now perhaps we can begin to see why Krishnamurti says that psychological time is an illusion. Psychological time is the kind of time in which I myself am going to become a new and improved version of myself. But if I myself am nothing but an image, like a photograph, that image does not have the nature or capacity to become anything other than what it is. I can imagine it if I like, but if I take that imagination to represent something actually possible, then I would be suffering from an illusion. So perhaps now we have a better sense of the meaning of psychological time. As far as I can understand it, psychological time is not really a different kind of time. It is still basically a form of chronological time, but it's applied in a direction where chronological time does not work. Chronological time can measure, a movement from here to there outwardly, but it cannot measure a movement inwardly because the psychological entity, myself, is merely an image, and so it's not susceptible to that kind of movement or change. So now let's see if this helps us understand the puzzle of the student who wants to become a lawyer. There's no doubt that he can engage in that outward behavior and achieve that external objective. But the inward change that the student hopes to achieve is more elusive. His image of himself will always remain only an image, something rooted in the past, like a photograph. Now, we should also be clear about why Krishnamurti considers this particular illusion to be so dangerous. People may have all kinds of illusions, but only this one is the one that Krishnamurti said, could be the wrong turn of humanity. And why can't we just shrug it off and say, okay, maybe I can't, hope to change or become in the way that I had intended to, but so what? What could be so bad about trying to become something better? How can that possibly be the wrong turn of humanity? So Krishnamurti evidently feels that there are a few things that are wrong with the process of becoming. The first thing is just that it can never work for reasons that we've already explained. An image is not the kind of thing like a seed or a caterpillar that is susceptible to change. And so any energy expended in that direction is futile. It's a waste of energy. It's like a car that is spinning its wheels. But in addition, the process of becoming generates inward conflict. It's all based on a division between what I am and what I think that I should be. And according to Krishnamurti, where there is division, there must be conflict. This is what I call Krishnamurti's law, because he said it repeatedly, and he often referred to it as a law, and I believe that it's original to him. So when I'm engaged in the process of becoming, one part of me is involved in a struggle with another part of me. It's kind of like driving a car and pressing on the accelerator and the brake at the same time. It's painful, it's confusing, and it's another form of wastage of energy. So where there is a division, there must be conflict. And the process of becoming represents a division between what I am and what I hope or want to become. But there's a third problem with becoming that may be even more fundamental. Because according to Krishnamurti, this process serves as an obstacle or block to the possibility of actual change. In other words, Krishnamurti maintains that there is a kind of inward psychological change that is in fact possible. We can call that genuine or authentic change. And he says that kind of change is actually blocked by the ordinary process of becoming that we've been discussing. So the kind of change Krishnamurti has in mind is not based on an image. For example, suppose that I have a sudden surge of emotional feeling. Suppose there occurs a wave of anger or desire for something. Krishnamurti says that any feeling of that kind is in fact susceptible or subject to change, but the process by which it occurs is entirely different from the process that we normally engage in. The normal process is becoming. If I'm angry, I may form an image of contentment or non-anger and start looking for ways to achieve that image. But according to Krishnamurti, the image of non-anger is the very thing that blocks the possibility of genuine change. Because by forming the image, I've stopped giving attention to the actual feeling itself. And he says that feeling can in fact undergo change, but only by not moving one's attention away from it. It's the act of giving total, undivided attention to the actual existing feeling that is the very catalyst that precipitates change in that feeling. So in making this claim, I believe that Krishnamurti has articulated, an important psychological principle that hasn't been previously discovered or expressed. Psychological change is possible only by giving one's total attention to the feeling or phenomenon that one wishes to change. In fact, even the wish to change a feeling is a movement away from it. What precipitates change is sheer observation unclouded, undistorted by any image of an alternative or any hope or effort to change. So now we have three reasons why the process of becoming is so dysfunctional. And we're not passing any kind of moral judgment or saying it's bad to engage in that process. We're just saying it's dysfunctional. It's a wastage of energy. It's a source of conflict and confusion. And it's the very thing that prevents genuine, authentic change. So we've come a long way in our effort to understand the paradox of change in the teachings of Krishnamurti. We've looked at what he means by becoming and why he feels it is problematical, but we haven't yet examined the other side of the equation, which is transformation, psychological revolution. So what is the nature and meaning of that kind of change, especially after we have discarded the ordinary idea of becoming? So it's helpful to remember that Krishnamurti deals with psychological issues through what he calls the negative approach. That means ending something rather than striving to create positive change. It comes from ending illusion, for example, and therefore ending the waste of energy. So by ending what is false, we remain with what is, and that's what precipitates genuine change. And this is very different, of course, from what happens outwardly. In the outer world, we can imagine what we want something to become, say a bridge over a river or a bull from a lump of clay, and achieve it. But psychological change functions differently. Psychologically, what we want to become is an obstacle to change. Therefore, Krishnamurti advocates the negative approach, negating illusion, negating anything that is not factual, not what is. So the radical transformation that Krishnamurti refers to is not a matter of undertaking any kind of positive action. It's not an achievement or any kind of accomplishment. It's the ending of something, the cessation of something. And it's not brought about through any deliberate, intentional act. Krishnamurti also insisted that there's no method to precipitate transformation. He said that any method is essentially mechanical in nature, and the method, more or less, determines what the result is going to be. But transformation is the beginning of something entirely new, so it cannot be contained within any kind of mechanical procedure. So transformation is not something you do, it's something that you see. It has the quality of insight. And that insight is non-verbal. It's a matter of seeing how certain things are related, but seeing in a non-verbal manner. It is a direct perception, not a verbal formula or a logical conclusion. And when we describe insight in this manner, it may seem a little bit mysterious, but really it's not. And we can get some feeling for it by examining some smaller, more accessible forms of nonverbal perception. So we're going to pause here and look at a couple of simple non-psychological insights to get a feeling for how this functions. Now, insight is very often a matter of discovering the illusory nature of an illusion. To find out that something you thought was real is actually an illusion, that's an insight. So let's take a very simple example of an illusion and a corresponding insight and get a feeling for how this works. So you may have observed how a cat behaves when it sees its reflection in a mirror, such as the floor-to-ceiling mirror that you sometimes see on the sliding door of a closet. When the cat sees itself in the mirror, it has no concept of a mirror or reflection or anything of that nature. And so it considers its reflection to be an actual cat. Your cat may approach its reflection and sniff it or even try to bat at it. It doesn't understand that what it's observing is just an image of itself. Now, suppose that your cat could understand English and we could explain all about mirrors and reflections and how the image is not an actual cat. Then, if your cat could understand what we were saying and see how it all fits together, then we could say the cat had an insight. In other words, at some point, the cat would have to see for itself the difference between a reflection and something actual. And at that point, we could say that the cat had an insight into that situation. So I think that that might be somewhat similar to the kind of transformation Krishnamurti is talking about. It's not something you do, it's something you see. And what you see is that something you took to be actual is in fact illusory. You have a direct, nonverbal perception of the illusory nature of the illusion. Now, let's consider another simple example. So, if we have only the evidence of our senses, if we have no other knowledge than the evidence of our eyes, we must believe that the sun is rotating around the earth. Through thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years, human beings could see nothing more basic or obvious than the sun rising in the east and moving across the sky and setting in the west. And not only the sun moves around the earth. You can see the moon moving across the sky at night, and even all the stars rotating around the earth on a nightly basis. So the earth was manifestly the center of everything, the center of the universe. And that was the basic state of affairs, the limit of human understanding right up until just a few hundred years ago. And then in the 16th century, Copernicus came along, and he brought together a lot of calculations, and he showed mathematically that, in fact, the Earth rotates around the sun. And when he did that, he was correcting a very, very basic and widespread illusion. And this correction had enormous consequences, because by that point in time, the Christian church had superimposed a whole mythological structure of God and heaven and hell that was all predicated on the earth being the center of the universe. So to overthrow all of that was to overthrow not only the evidence of our senses, but also this massive religious structure of belief. And that's why when we talk about a really great, profound revolution, we call it Copernican. And Copernicus himself understood very well how dangerous his findings were to the dominant worldview of his day. And that's why he waited until the very last days of his life to publish his results. And we know how society and the church reacted. There was the famous trial of Galileo over this issue, and about 20 years before that trial, there was a situation with the monk, Giordano Bruno, who was tortured in the public square and publicly executed because he maintained that the sun, not the earth, was the center of the solar system. So, coming back to the evidence of our senses, how is an ordinary person supposed to make sense of what Copernicus discovered? We can see the sun moving across the sky every day. How can that happen if the earth is actually moving around the sun? So in order to understand this, we also have to know that the earth is rotating on its axis every 24 hours. Once we have that awareness, we can then have the insight that the sun moving across the sky is just an appearance, that it's not really actual. It looks like the sun is moving, but that visual evidence is produced by the daily rotation of the earth on its axis, and to see the actual correct set of relationships is an insight. Now, I think that when Krishnamurti speaks of a transformation of consciousness, he's talking about something of a similar magnitude to the insight of Copernicus. but it's an inward insight into the nature of thought and personal identity, rather than into the earth and sun. It involves a fundamental reconfiguration of consciousness, just as Copernicus discovered a reconfiguration of the elements of the solar system. Krishnamurti says that our consciousness at present is broken up. He says that it contains a deep division. On the one hand, there are all the things that we think and feel, all the things that we know and believe and fear, all that we could call the content of our consciousness. On the other hand, there's me, there's myself, the one who has the thoughts and feelings and the knowledge. And Krishnamurti maintains that this division is based on an illusion. It's based on taking an image for an actuality. And that illusion has very, very dangerous, dysfunctional consequences for the whole of life and humanity. So psychological revolution therefore entails having an insight into the illusory nature of that division. And such an insight would actually heal the structure of consciousness and make us undivided and whole. So now let's go back to our point of departure and see if we can understand or resolve the paradox of change. Krishnamurti is very critical of the process of becoming, striving to become someone more or better than what we are. At the same time, he also advocates a radical change, what he calls psychological revolution. So how are we to understand this apparent contradiction? What kind of psychological change is he advocating if he is so opposed to the process of self-improvement or becoming? So far we've considered this paradox from two different directions. On the one hand, we've examined why Krishnamurti feels that self-improvement or becoming is so problematical. And on the other hand, we've seen a little bit what is involved in his idea of transformation. So now, how can we put these two things together? Because I think if we could see both sides of this equation at the same time as parts of a whole, it will help us resolve the paradox of change in Krishnamurti's philosophy. So to bring this about, to see both sides as parts of a larger whole, let's go back to the process of becoming and take our exploration a little bit further. Suppose I've understood why Krishnamurti objects to this process, and I begin to see the need to stop engaging in becoming. But that's not as easy as it might seem at first, because the fabric of psychological time is embedded in the structure of our thought, and it has a life of its own. It tends to function whether we want it to or not. As a result, if we see the importance of this issue, we might resolve to put an end to this process of becoming within ourselves. We might decide to give it up, to quit doing it. But do you see the difficulty with that? If I resolve that I'm going to end the process of becoming, I'm already engaging in that very process. I'm projecting a goal, an inward state of affairs that I want to achieve. And that is the very thing that Krishnamurti is objecting to. So the process of becoming can only come to an end if it is effortless. And that means it occurs as a result of an insight. It requires an insight into the nature of psychological time, which means why that kind of time is illusory. And that requires an insight into the nature of the self, because if the self is just an image instead of an actual living entity, then it's not the kind of thing that is capable of change or transformation, in the same way that a seed can become a plant, or a caterpillar can become a butterfly. But to have these insights into psychological time and the nature of the self is the very thing that Krishnamurti calls psychological revolution. So the complete ending of the process of becoming, including the insights that make that ending possible, is itself a transformation of consciousness. And that, I think, is how we can resolve the paradox of change in the teachings of Krishnamurti. So I'd like to wrap this up by reading a couple of short excerpts from one of the entries in the book. The Urgency of Change. These excerpts come from the fourth entry in that book, which is called How to Live in This World. It's one of the longest entries in the book and covers a lot of material, but towards the end, the questioner asks, how am I to change? And Krishnamurti replies, to live in this world sanely, there must be a radical change of the mind and of the heart. And so the conversation proceeds to examine change in great detail. I recommend that you read and see much more than what I'm explaining here. But Krishnamurti says in part that if you have a feeling like anger or greed or envy, the very naming of that feeling preserves it and sustains it. He says, the naming of the feeling reestablishes it in the old pattern. If you do not name it, which means you don't identify yourself with it, then the feeling is new and it'll go away by itself. So there is Krishnamurti's principle of how genuine change comes about. And this prepares the ground for the conclusion of that passage. And Krishnamurti describes in greater detail what he considers to be authentic change. He says this, any movement away from what I am strengthens what I am. So change is no movement at all. Change is the denial of change. And he adds that you can only talk about authentic, genuine change when all movement of thought has come to an end. He says all movement of thought must be denied for the beauty of non-change. In the total negation of all movement of thought away from what is the ending of what is. And those remarks form the conclusion of that entry in that book, How to Live in This World. So we're going to take a short break, I think just a few minutes, and after that we'll have some questions and answers with Karen and Nandini. And I just wanted to say also that if anybody out there has any comments for me or questions, you can leave them for me. There's a contact form on my website, and I'd be very happy to respond to any questions or comments that anyone may have. So I guess we're going to take a few-minute break now and then come back, right? Okay.
Thank you, David.
Okay, thank you.
That was really fun.
Oh, good. Delighted.
I really enjoyed how you did the deep dive into psychological revolution.
Aha.
Yeah, because it does seem that there is a lot of confusion about that. And I really feel you helped to clarify it.
You've noticed a feeling of confusion among people that you've
Yeah,
spoken
in
with?
general,
Or,
yeah.
yeah.
This impossible psychological revolution
Oh, how it's
without
impossible.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, it can be a little confusing.
So, our 30 minutes that we have today, we have time for Nandini and I to ask some questions.
Quiz me.
Yeah, quiz you. And looks like you're ready.
Expose all the flaws in what I presented.
Right. And then Leah also has questions from our online people. So hopefully we'll have time for a little bit of both.
Okay, good.
Okay. So I'd like to just pose one question as an educator, this concern about words and using words accurately.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when it comes to listening to a student and trying to interpret what the situation is, and or oneself, listening to oneself as psychologically. So the problem with words is the label. The label of a student or a teacher or a person. The label that becomes an image, or maybe the image starts and then the word comes later. But in terms of this conversation, I'm wondering if we could explore the difference between using words correctly and using them as image formation words. So, for example, if I lie and then I call myself a liar,
Mm-hmm.
it's so different from saying I lied yesterday.
Yeah.
And when we hear each other using terms like, well, he is, and fill in the blank, he's a great guy, he's a thief, or whatever we do with all the labels, and she's a slow learner.
Did you say he's a thief?
Uh-huh.
A thief, okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, any label you put is a trigger. It's to me, it's a symptom that something's haywire, right? We're using the language incorrectly, and the image gets to start moving and feasting on that fixation.
Right, right.
And so maybe we could talk and explore a little bit more about how language can help us unpack the illusions of the psychological self. Because
Okay.
it might be a fact that I lied, but it isn't the fact that I'm a liar.
Mm-hmm.
There's a distinction.
Okay. I thought you were going to take it in a different
Well,
direction.
take it in a different way.
I thought you were going to
That's
say,
fine.
how can we understand how language can prevent us from understanding psychological revolution? Right?
Well, that too.
It's kind of both, right?
Yeah, I think that's what the paradox is that it can be both.
Yeah.
That you can hold the apparent contradictions in your hand, and that might be another way we can look at it. But
yeah.
Anyway.
So there are a lot of ways that kind of process can occur. The way that Krishnamurti often refers to doesn't involve, me and another person. It's just within myself. I'm involved in a situation where something is upsetting and the emotion, the feeling flares up. And, he advocates just looking at that feeling non-verbally. He says, the minute I call that feeling anger, I've already done something. That's not just a trivial thing to label it in that way. That word and the associations with that word affect that feeling and tend to preserve it, and it's counterproductive. It creates a sense of separation between me who's thinking it and the anger which is over there. So it has a lot of ramifications just within myself. But then you bring out an even more, perhaps, difficult and complex thing where I say, "You're angry. Why are you mad at me?" Right? And so now I've projected that label onto you.
Yeah.
And then you react to that label, right?
Yeah.
You say, "What? Me? Angry? Never."
I'm not an angry person.
Right. So that, what part of the way out of this, I think, is just to be aware of that process, is to develop a heightened sensitivity to how we react to words and how words shape our feelings and our interactions. And so I think you're totally correct to bring this up in the context of education, because when Krishnamurti says, he wants his schools for the purpose of educating the whole of life, that's the whole of life, part of it, right? Is helping students understand the way in which language, very much affects not only how we treat ourselves, but how we treat one another and the whole quality of our relationships. Is that kind of what you were getting at?
Yeah, it was. So thank you.
Okay, good.
Nandini.
It was such a profound talk that my mind was very quiet. And when the mind is so quiet, questions do not come to the mind.
All right.
So in a minute or two, maybe the mind became restless once again and the questions started coming.
Uh-huh.
I was particularly interested when you brought in the word insight.
Insight, yeah.
Yes. And what I have observed in myself, usually after thinking much, there is a realization, which is kind of a conclusion from my thinking. So, how would you say that? What is it? How would you differentiate between an insight and a realization, which is a byproduct of careful, logical thinking? Is there a difference? Because most people think that after thinking for a long time, they have an insight. So, is insight, I know that insight is not a matter of conclusion, but sometimes a realization comes after very thorough, careful, logical thinking. Is there a difference?
So I can't really answer that question necessarily. The thing about insight, Krishnamurti talks about insight, intelligence, awareness. There's a whole family of things which kind of go together in the way he presents things. And, he says that, you might have thought something over for a while, but then the moment of insight occurs between thoughts, when thought is momentarily in abeyance. He gives the example of an engineer who invented the jet engine, right? He had to do all the things you talked about: study, learn, gather knowledge about conventional forms of flight and aeronautics. But to see something new, all of that had to go into abeyance, at least for a moment. And he says something else which is interesting. He says that insight is not caused. It's not a matter of cause and effect. So the relationship between that thinking process that you described and, say a moment of clarity, I think you just have to watch it in yourself and discover it. I don't know how far we can get with kind of trying to describe it or prescribe rules. It's more a matter of seeing, in your own daily life, what leads to what or what precipitates what.
That's right, because I think insight, from my own observation, I can say that insight comes from it's like a fireworks,
Like a what?
like a fireworks. It suddenly erupts,
Uh-huh.
and you have a flash of understanding
A flash, yeah.
without thinking about it anything before that. So I was wondering, like many people might confuse a logical realization with an insight, which probably are not two connected things. That was what I was thinking.
Yeah, and then, then the other thing is that you can have a moment of insight, and then immediately your thought comes in and takes
Yes.
that nonverbal perception and puts it into words. And at the moment you put it into words, very often is the moment when you have a sense that you've really got it, something you can hold on to. So I think it's kind of a subtle interplay between those different things.
Do we have any questions from the citizens?
The first question from a commenter says, Krishnamurti said judgment is a source of conflict. How is that different than making a distinction? For example, it is hot today. I need to bring water. Isn't judgment part of our survival?
Well, that kind of judgment, absolutely. And Krishnamurti acknowledged that. He gives an example. He loved clothing, and he used to go to the very best tailors in London. And you have to make a decision: do I want this fabric for my shirt or that fabric? And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think my impression, my understanding, and again, I hesitate to, it makes me a little uncomfortable to be in this position of trying to speak for what he says. But my understanding is that the place where judgment is more detrimental has to do with my understanding of myself. And it's not just a judgment between, is this fabric more what I like instead of that fabric, but the kind of judgment which has, a moral quality to it, of a more moral sense of good and bad. So that if I have a feeling, suppose I have a feeling of aggression, suppose I have a feeling of violence, right? I need to be able to see that feeling in order to understand it. And if I oppose it and say, oh, that's bad, I've got to get away from that, then I can't understand that feeling. I can't observe it. It doesn't mean I'm going to run out and be violent, but I've got to be able to look at it non-judgmentally in order to see what it is. So my understanding and impression of what he's saying is that that's where the judgment it can take on a more negative, or let's say more dysfunctional quality. He spoke in terms of choiceless awareness. And when he said that, he wasn't talking about going into the shop of the tailor and having choiceless awareness of different kinds of fabric. He's talking about choiceless awareness of oneself, of one's own thoughts and feelings, so that there's not that kind of judgment of what you yourself are doing, and therefore you can actually see and be in touch with what you really are.
Also, what comes to mind is this thing about language, and not to be harping on it, but if there's a judgment, often there's a word attached to it that is, it's like the red flag. It's a signal that we're doing this thing about holding an image of ourselves or another. And so it's something to notice. That, and the words are nice, easy things to notice. I mean, because they fly through the brain all the time. And if we're labeling something, but it's a different kind of label when it's psychological from when it's just, that's a white chair. So.
Actually, that reminds me, Karen, of another thing that David brought up in his talk, the psychological self.
Mm-hmm.
I know quite a few younger people who are very much rattled by what Kay has said or written. And in my discussion with them, they have often asked, all their life they have been raised in the culture of acknowledging a self, the
Yeah,
psychological self.
absolutely.
Now suddenly they come and confronted with the not like the whole concept of the psychological self is an illusion.
Yeah.
So what would be your how would you respond to this question of their confusion? What is to do? The culture is right or K is right?
Yeah, that's a tough one because, it's characteristic of the whole of Krishnamurti's philosophy that it's extremely original. It's very much, if you go down the path that he's talking about, you have to get very far away from what our conventional ideas are about psychology and human relationship. His whole point of view is very original, and that's why he stresses over and over that if you're going to undertake psychological inquiry, the very first step, the most important thing is freedom. You have got to put aside all authority. You have to put aside all received tradition. And you just have to start fresh, completely fresh. And that's not an easy thing to do. And it's not a very comfortable thing to do because, it's a funny thing, part of tradition is to say you must value tradition. So it's already self-reinforcing, right? So to put all that aside is a very unusual and challenging thing to do. And that's part of the reason I think why he felt it was so important to have schools, so that this kind of thing can be introduced gently in a safe environment from a young age, because by the time someone is 25 or 30 or 50 and they're completely absorbed all of the standard values and beliefs of society, it's very hard to break away from all of that. And Krishnamurti's point of view is so original. He does not fall in any conventional category of religious teacher or guru or philosopher. He's unique. And so he means it when he says you have to begin with freedom. You have to put aside everything you've learned and look afresh in order to follow what he's trying to point out.
Do you have another question?
Okay, the next one says, neuroscience talks about changing your thought patterns to change yourself. What do you think Kay would say about this type of change?
Say it again for me, please.
Sure.
Neuroscience says what?
Neuroscience talks about changing your thought patterns to change yourself. What do you think Kay would say about this type of change?
Okay, so here I am. I've got these thought patterns which make me uncomfortable, or which are causing me difficulties. So I'm going to change my thought patterns. I'm the one who's thinking it, but I'm going to change my thought patterns. Something gets very confused there. So neuroscience, how does neuroscience propose that this is going to happen? Is it just something that I do by myself? Or is it something that I have some kind of machine that is going to help me think the right kind of thoughts? Krishnamurti would be appalled, I think. It's something so mechanical and limited and prescribed, and it does not express that quality of freedom and actually seeing what is. The problem is not that I should learn how to change my thoughts. The problem is that I should see for myself what is actually going on within myself and in my relationships. And I'm not sure that neuroscience can help me do that by helping me change my thoughts. What do you think?
Yeah, it's one of those circular things.
Circular, yeah.
It seems like when you're sitting quietly and noticing what the thinking is doing, how the brain is working. Oh, there's a thought, there's another thought, and they seem to be just going all over the place. Why not begin there? Would just watching your thinking affect your thinking instead of trying to impose something on the thinking? Because who's imposing? Is it the thinker? Another thinker? I mean, how many thinkers are there? You know, it seems like there are all these thinkings, you know, contradicting each other. So it's an exciting journey, really, to just notice what's going on in the brain, one thing at a time, if you could. And who's you?
And also, you know, I think the very word change, whether it is the neuroscientists talking about the changing the pattern of thought, they want to change only one aspect of thought, not the whole of thought. They want to change what they don't like or somebody doesn't like. So, as long as we are touching only aspects of the fact still remains. We are only scratching on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
So, is it the right approach to change the pattern of thought, which means only attacking certain parts of the thought? Or should the whole being of thought has to be taken into consideration, whether it is valid or not?
Yeah, good. Is that it, or are there more questions?
There's more if you'll take more.
Okay, sure.
Okay, the next one says, I live in Delhi and I see a lot of suffering these days. How do I help people psychologically? How to help those who are in pain because of losing someone they love?
Yeah, that's of course very difficult. The situation in India is so appalling, so much death, and I just don't know. I don't know how to even begin to approach that. It's I don't know if you can say anything which would be meaningful to someone who's actually in that situation. I think that person just has got to see what is in front of them at the moment and deal with it as honestly as they can. I don't really have anything more that I could contribute beyond that. It's just such a tragic situation that is going on there at present.
Yeah. Sitting with somebody and not saying anything is probably a soothing thing. To not add more words to something that's already overwhelming. Good luck.
And also saying a few words that come most spontaneously, naturally, without much planning. That would be the very natural way of expressing oneself. I have extended family members and good friends who have gone through this situation. What do I do? What do I say? Whatever naturally comes to my mind at the moment of hearing something, that is the only thing we can do.
Okay. When Krishnamurti says, "Why don't you change?" what does this imply? What are we capable of changing that we are not doing? Our escapes? Our disconnect with what is? Our mechanicalness?
Yes, all of the above, for sure. There are so many things that we both can do and can stop doing. Just to put aside all of the escapes by itself is huge in terms of, what he calls self-knowledge or learning about oneself. So all of the things that that person suggested, I would endorse and more. I'd just like to say one other thing, one other thing that is confusing about what Krishnamurti says about time. When he says that there's no time involved in change. As I discussed in my talk, people often interpret that to mean that either I change right now or it's never going to happen. But when he says there's no time involved, it doesn't mean there's no chronological time, right? I can be studying myself, and he says that it's a matter of discipline and diligence and observation, which may go on for many, many days or years. It's the putting aside of psychological time. It's the putting aside that psychological projection of myself into the future. That's where the difficulty comes. But the actual business of observing and seeing actual relationships, that goes on all the time through chronological time. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what we all have to do.
And David, I have a question in connection with time.
Yeah.
What do you say to a person like we have been used to living in time? Physical time, functional time. Also, the psychological time comes in. So, for example, suppose I have an exam tomorrow.
Yeah.
That is a chronological time. I have it tomorrow.
Absolutely.
But as I'm preparing for the test, I have all the psychological time coming into me. The anxiety, the fear, the need for security, everything comes in. So how does the mind recognize that, okay, this is the functional time and this is the psychological time, and I do not go in the wrong direction? Is it possible that we really see the difference? We see it intellectually, but how do we see it in every moment of our life?
Yeah, that's such a good question. A part of me hesitates to say anything because the very question is just perfect. Mm-hmm. But that's why I tried to bring in the example of the student who wants to become a lawyer, because in that case, as similar to the case that you described, there are many things which occur during the course of daily life which are not just one thing or the other. They're both. It is something happening in chronological time, and it's also something happening in psychological time. Mm-hmm. And to see that distinction, yeah, it requires sensitivity, it requires awareness, and in some cases it's just not obvious at all. It may be confusing, but that's part of the challenge and it's also part of the fun, the joy of exploring these teachings is to see distinctions like that, which may not have been so obvious at first.
So would you say that the mind which is alert would eventually see that?
I'd say the mind which is alert would see it right now, not eventually.
From time to time, yes.
Yeah. Is that it, Henry? Are we finished?
Sounds
Karen?
good.
Yeah, that was a good note. I like that. That's a good place to wrap it up, I think.